used to be a nation of farmers, but now it's less than 2% of the population in the United States. And so a lot of us don't know what it takes to grow food.
Over 12,000 years ago, people began planting and saving seed. Agriculture flowered, and civilizations were born. In China, thousands of varieties of rice were grown. Over 5,000 kinds of potatoes were cultivated worldwide. In the US alone, more than 7,000 varieties of apples were grown in the 19th century. In the 20th century, the face of farming underwent a radical change. The manufacture of nitrogen-based bombs during World War I led to the development of nitrogen-based chemical fertilizers. Nerve gas, developed during World War II, was slightly modified to make insecticides. DDT was the hero of its generation. New technologies promised higher yields, increased food production, cheaper prices, and greater availability. By the mid-20th century, these technologies, along with new developments in plant breeding, led to the Green Revolution.
I think the people who first imagined the Green Revolution had good hearts. Lots of people are starving around the planet. That's long been the case in human civilization. Their thinking was if we could just systematize agriculture like we did industry in the 1800s and bring it worldwide, bring one system that works, we can solve the problems that people have long had with agriculture.
The next several decades saw a remarkable increase in production. Year after year, huge fields were planted with only one variety of crop. These monocultures created an ecological vacuum that insects and disease could exploit. This uniformity has led to some of the greatest agricultural catastrophes of mankind. In the mid-1800s, very few varieties of potatoes were cultivated in Ireland. When they became diseased, 1 million people died. When the same potato blight attacked Peru, they suffered fewer consequences. Today, only 4 varieties of potatoes are widely grown. 97% of the varieties of vegetables grown at the beginning of the 20th century are now extinct. Genetic uniformity leads to an increased vulnerability to insects and disease. Farmers found themselves trapped on a pesticide treadmill. The more they sprayed, the more they had to spray. The increased use of fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides increased costs, polluted water, and created health risks. Then in the 1970s, Monsanto introduced Roundup. Because of its ability to kill most weeds, it became one of the most popular herbicides in history. In the mid-1990s, building on technologies that used gene splicing, the Green Revolution turned into the Gene Revolution. Capitalizing on the new technology, Monsanto genetically modified its seeds to be Roundup ready. Normally, Roundup kills anything green, but if the plant is Roundup ready, when it is sprayed, it doesn't die. Now the company that sells you the herbicide also sells you the seed.
A generation ago, farmers would seed a crop and use a herbicide when necessary, but often they wouldn't need to use a herbicide. And today you have a crop that, right when it goes in the ground, is designed to be sprayed.
With Monsanto's Bt corn, the corn itself is registered as an insecticide. This is because every cell has been engineered to manufacture Bt, a natural bacterial toxin. If a corn borer eats any part of the plant, it will die.
And now that we have genetic engineering, we're not just, putting chemicals in this food, we're actually industrializing the food at the genetic cellular level.
One of the most controversial aspects of the gene revolution is the patenting of seeds.
There was a very good reason why for virtually 200 years the Patent Office and Congress did not allow for the patenting of life.
The right to patent is guaranteed by Article 1 in the Constitution. Food crops were deliberately excluded from patenting on moral grounds. Starting in the 1930s, plant breeders were given the right to patent their work. But the patent protection did not extend to the subsequent generations of seeds.
Clearly when you patent a tennis racket, let's say with a new sweet spot, you can describe that very accurately to the Patent Office. But how in the world can you describe a whole plant, much less generations down when that's changed and mutated?
But in 1978, Dr. Ananda Chakrabarty took the first living organism to the Patent Office.
Chakrabarty was an engineer for General Electric, and he created an oil-eating microbe and tried to get it patented. And the U.S. Patent Office said, no way, we do not allow you to patent parts of nature. If you have a tennis racket or a toaster, you can patent that, but you can't patent a part of nature. But General Electric and Chakrabarty were very insistent. They took it all the way to the Supreme Court. And at one vote majority decision, they said, you can patent this genetically engineered microbe. Interestingly enough, this oil-eating microbe was never used because even though it did eat oil and oil spills, it apparently ate a lot of other things for dessert.
The floodgates were now open for genetic engineering.
During the Reagan administration, they said, let's patent animals. And then human genes and human body parts. I think what the companies would like to say is, we are patenting the gene. And wherever that gene goes, we own anything that we put it in. If it goes into a plant, we own the plant. If it goes into an animal, we own the animal. They might even say around the world, if it goes into a human being, we own that human being. There would be some constitutional problems with that in the United States. But they clearly would want their patent to follow the gene.
The issue of patenting life has never been voted on by the people or the Congress of the United States.
It actually means giving corporations, incredibly, the power to own, control the species of the earth.
While corporations were patenting everything under the sun, they were also busy in another area.
Starting in about 1995, the stock market was running up, and Monsanto was buying up seed companies, and DuPont was buying Pioneer, and there was this, basically, the U.S. pesticide industry bought the seed industry for all intents and purposes.
Monsanto spends $8 billion buying up seed companies. By the 1990s, corporations begin patenting not only GMO seeds, but seeds that haven't been genetically engineered. The only requirement is that they have not been patented before.
It's one of the wonderful things about what our government has done for the years with seeds is trying to save seeds so that we can preserve biodiversity. What companies have done is gone into those seed banks, find the seeds that aren't patented, and patent them. And as long as they're the first person at the patent office, they get the patent.
It is estimated that Monsanto owns 11,000 patents.
Why would corporations do this? Because then they can take the one seed they want to use to replace all these seeds, and it will own the marketplace.
In Canada, the question of patenting landed directly in Percy Schmeizer's field.
I've been farming for 53 years, and in those years I've grown mostly wheat, canola, oats, and peas. This field has had wheat, and the field behind me has canola in it, or rapeseed as it is known in Europe. When our grandparents came to this country, there was no such thing as chemical companies or seed companies, and they had to rely and develop their own seed, borrow seed from their neighbors, or bring it from Europe with them.
Percy was known in this part of Canada as a seed developer and a seed saver.
I would say that our best grains, our best seeds, have not been developed by research people or scientists. They have been developed by farmers.
In 1997, Percy sprayed Monsanto's Roundup around the power poles and ditches as he had done for years. Some canola plants did not die.
I thought initially that some of those plants didn't die because I had been spraying year after year after year with Roundup in the same area, and companies warn you you shouldn't spray every year because you could develop a resistance. Monsanto found out about it, and they went on my land that I farm without my knowledge, without my permission, and took plants or seeds and said some of that was Monsanto's Roundup Ready canola. In August the 6th of 1998, they launched a lawsuit against me.
Monsanto claimed that Percy had illegally obtained their genetically modified canola without a license and had infringed on their patent.
Patents historically have been for things like, I've used the example of a carburetor. Well, a carburetor doesn't get up one day and start replicating itself everywhere and introducing itself into your car, so that all of a sudden you have somebody else's carburetor one morning and then you get sued for patent infringement. So that's the unique nature of this type of technology, that once you've unleashed it into the environment, uncontrolled and unconfined, it will spread everywhere.
Before the main trial, Monsanto withdrew then all their allegations against me that I had ever obtained a seed illegally. And they went on to say that it didn't matter how the seed got on to my land, I still infringed on their patent.
Because my land is on the east side of the road, the main road, the prevailing winds here are from the west. So it would be natural for the canola that blew off of trucks to land in the field here. In fact, one farmer told me that when he drove past my land hauling a Roundup Ready canola, his tarp had broken, and he estimated he lost enough past my 2 miles of land to seed 2,000 acres.
Well, I think one of the biggest issues in the case is where to draw the line between the people and the companies who produce and come up with this new technology. The line ended up being drawn way into the farmers' fields. And our contention was the line should clearly be drawn such that farmers have a right to continue to farm. They should be able to save and reuse their own seed. They should be able to buy seed, conventional seed, from their neighbors as they've had in the past, without having to worry about whether they're infringing somebody's patent now.
1999, when I went to seed my canola fields, I was advised by my lawyer not to use my own seed again because I now knew it was contaminated by Monsanto's genetic altered canola. And it was seed that was adapted to this region and grew quite well because it was resistant to various diseases.
Percy destroyed over 1,000 pounds of seed that he and his wife had developed over decades.
The lawsuit and my loss of my seeds was the hardest thing that could have ever happened to us.
Now here Monsanto comes along, what we worked for all these years, they just want to take it away just like that from us. I could never do that to go into their office and take anything. I would be prosecuted. And they can just come and do anything to the farmers just like they own them or so. It really is upsetting. And I feel they've taken my rights away and my privacy. And we're not the only ones they've been doing too, as many others. Why are they prosecuting so many of these little farmers? Well, they only may be worth a couple of 100,000 when they're such a multinational company. Why? Is it greed, or is it they just want to control all the seeds?
Percy was not the only farmer accused by Monsanto.
In the summer of 2000, my family and I were discussing how rude we thought it was that Monsanto never sent us a letter or thanked us for cooperating with their investigation into our business. We were stunned when in late July of the year 2000, we received a letter from a law firm in New Orleans that was representing Monsanto Company, accusing us of infringing on their patent. Every accused grower in the United States that I've talked to had nearly identical stories. They come and test your crop. The farmers that have nothing to hide figure, well, they'll find that we didn't plant this crop that they say, and they come back over a year later and accuse you of this when the farmer can't go back and take crop samples and disprove them. Monsanto had told us that they had sampled all 3,850 acres of our soybean crop. The samplers would have had to have been gathering one sample continuously every 20 seconds. After examining the testimony that we gave, realized their story didn't add up. Now they changed their story, saying they only took a handful of samples per field. Are we to assume that they were lying in their first attempt to extort money from us, or are they lying now?
Estimates are that Monsanto has sent out 9,000 letters to farmers. Most farmers choose to pay to avoid lawsuits. Even so, there are 100 active lawsuits in the United States alone. When the farmers do settle with Monsanto, they have to agree to never discuss their settlement.
We feel that we were profiled by Monsanto because of the size of our farm, and that they wanted to try to make an example out of us to scare other farmers into never saving their own seed, to be too scared to save their own seed.
Eventually, my case went to court after 2.5 years, and Monsanto dragged me through those courts in pre-trial. They did everything to break me and basically took all of our retirement funds, because just my lawyer fees alone up to date have been about $200,000.
One of the sons said, "Mom and Dad, I hope it won't get you down because they're trying to destroy you, but I hope you're strong and you just get through it all." He says, that's the only way the changes will be made in our country with these big companies.
Monsanto ready to wage war. Schmeizer's case opened the door for Monsanto to pursue other patent breaches. A lot of people have asked me why I didn't just settle. I probably could have settled for maybe a slap on the wrist or maybe a few $1,000s fine. But what I did was talk it over with my wife and said, look, they destroyed our seed, everything we've worked for in the last 50 years. And if I sign this, that I grew genetic altered canola without a license when we were doing our own thing, minding our own business, I couldn't live with myself. And I feel that it was taking my fundamental rights away from me. My grandparents left a system like that way back turn of the century to get away from control and a feudal type system. Are we going to want to go back to that? And we said no. We'll fight it and stand up for what we believe in.
And what did the judge rule after 2.5 weeks of trial? He said it didn't matter how Monsanto's genetic altered canola got into my field. And then he went on and specified. He said whether it cross-pollinated or if it blew in by the wind, by birds, bees, animals, or falling off a farmer's truck, a combine, and so on, it didn't matter. The fact that there was some plants there, I violated Monsanto's patent, even though I didn't want it in my field. Number 2, which is the most important one, I think, he ruled any farmer that has a regular conventional plant, it doesn't matter what kind of plant, if it's a tree, if it's a seed, and it gets cross-pollinated with Monsanto's gene against your wishes and destroys your property, My plant becomes Monsanto's property. Now stop and think what that means to farmers all over the world, farmers, gardeners, anything to do with a life-giving form. The third issue, he ruled, the fact that I never use Monsanto's patent, which means I never use Monsanto's Roundup Ready herbicide or glyphosate on my crop, he ruled that's immaterial. He said the fact was that there were some plants there. So that shows you the power of patent law over farmers' rights.
If you go and look at a canola field that's 1/2 GMO, 1/2 regular canola, you will not be able to tell the difference between the two. They grow the same, they act the same. The only way you'll be able to discover it's there is if you go spray Roundup. Well, what you killed is your own, and what survived belongs to Monsanto now as a result of this case.
In the last 2 months, I probably had 100 phone calls, minimum, about people finding canola in their fields that never ever had it before. And I think it would be safe to say that it would be very difficult to find one field in Western Canada that would not now be contaminated to some degree with Monsanto's GMO canola.
There's an old sort of ethic that emerged in agriculture communities, and I grew up with that ethic. And the basic ethic was that if I decided to bring an agricultural enterprise into my neighborhood that was potentially damaging to my neighbors, for example, if I decide to raise cattle, and those cattle are potentially very damaging to my neighbor's crops, it's my responsibility to fence the cattle in. It's not my neighbor's responsibility to fence them out to prevent damage to his crops. The way that the system is functioning now, it's my responsibility to fence that technology out from my crops. And of course, there's no way that you can build a fence high enough to prevent that. We know that now.
All species have developed elaborate mechanisms over millions of years to protect their cells from invasion from foreign DNA. Genetic engineers have to overcome the integrity of the species barrier to insert a new genetic trait into a plant or animal. When scientists began genetic engineering 30 years ago, they believed that one gene expressed one trait, that transgenic DNA would be stable even when forced to cross species barriers.
A new technique of molecular biology appears to have allowed us to outdo the standard events of evolution.
In 1975, a conference of pioneers in genetic engineering was held to discuss the issues of safety and ethics of the newly discovered transgenic research. Some biologists argued for a moratorium on research until the safety of the technology could be established.
It is not known what sort of risk this is going to create because we have no tests.
The conference delegates voted against the moratorium, but did pledge to keep all recombinant DNA and genetically engineered organisms contained safely within laboratories. Currently, both agriculture and medical biotechnology use genetic engineering. Medical biotechnology has created many life-saving products. These pharmaceuticals are made under controlled conditions in secure labs. Genetically modified plants, unlike drugs, reproduce, and once released into the environment, cannot be controlled.
Using biotechnology to produce food is not new. For nearly 6,000 years, people have used yeast, a living organism, to make bread rise. And we've used biotech for almost as long to ferment beer and wine.
So there's really nothing new here. But that is completely wrong. Genetic engineering is really a radical revolution in food production. It's really a cell invasion technology. You know, people have heard they're taking a flounder gene and putting it in tomato so the tomato can last in cold temperatures. But people ask, how does that flounder gene get in that tomato? How does it get in there? And what really happens is the only way you can do it is to invade the cell of the tomato and deposit the flounder gene. Well, what's good at invading cells? Bacteria and viruses.
After 12 years of searching, Monsanto found a soil bacteria that is naturally immune to Roundup herbicide. Their goal was to genetically engineer DNA from these bacteria into various plants. They cut out a sequence of DNA that is resistant to Roundup. But if this DNA sequence alone is inserted into a corn plant, it will have no effect. So the next step involves E. coli bacteria. Gaps are created in the E. coli DNA, and when the two test tubes are mixed together, some of the E. coli DNA recombines with the Roundup-resistant bacteria. Then the technicians smuggle the engineered DNA into the cells of the corn plant they want to modify. Cells will naturally reject foreign DNA, so they developed a method using soil bacteria that causes tumors in plants. They use this bacteria to ferry the engineered DNA into the plant's nucleus. There are also two other methods used to get the engineered DNA through the cell wall. One uses a stream of electricity to create tiny holes in the plant cells so they become vulnerable to infiltration by foreign DNA. Another is the gene gun, which blasts particles of gold coated with engineered DNA into the plant cells. Each of these three methods needs a promoter gene that turns on the desired characteristics. The promoter gene is often extracted from the cauliflower mosaic virus.
This capacity of bacteria and viruses to invade mammals in different ways is what really has a lot of people edgy about biotechnology, because that's really what the tools are all about. In order to move genetic material from one organism to another that don't normally cross, you've got to sort of behave like bacteria and viruses and invade into the cells and become established, just like the virus must become established.
And they do one more thing. They attach to that an antibiotic marker system.
The antibiotic marker is a gene which is naturally resistant to a specific antibiotic, so later they can test whether the genetic cassette is being expressed.
The most cataclysmic force in the food system right now is the fact that the medical community is just terrified about the loss of antibiotics. No one really understands how using antibiotic marker genes in genetic engineering techniques might contribute to the problem. The biomedical community on a worldwide basis is absolutely focused on this problem now.
As we move on into this so-called biotech revolution and we start producing more and more transgenic manipulations, we'll start seeing pieces of DNA interacting with each other in ways that are totally unpredictable.
We have now learned that genes function in complex networks, and a single gene can express or influence many traits.
I think this is probably the largest biological experiment humanity has ever entered into.
The Flavor Saver tomato was the first genetically engineered food to reach the public. Calgene, the corporation that produced the tomato, had done 3 voluntary feeding studies on rats and found lesions in some of the rats' stomachs. Over the objections of several government scientists, the tomatoes were approved in May 1994. The flavor-saver tomato didn't hold up in shipping, and consumers didn't like it, so it was taken off the market. The first time many Americans became aware that genetically modified foods were part of their everyday diet was in the year 2001.
Last fall, during lunch with co-workers, Grace Booth enjoyed 3 chicken enchiladas. The food, she recalls, was very good, but then something went very wrong.
I felt my chest getting tight, and it was hard to breathe.
She didn't know, but she was going into shock.
What are you thinking at this point?
I thought, oh my God, what is happening to me? What is going on? Something is very, very wrong. I felt like I was going to die.
In the emergency room in nearby Oakland, the diagnosis was severe allergic reaction. And from here, Grace Booth's story reached official Washington. At the time, the national corn market was in an uproar. Starlink, a gene-modified corn not approved for human food, had been found in taco shells, and recalls were emptying the shelves of corn products. The fear was possible allergic reactions.
If I want a bowl of cornflakes, I want to know that it's safe to eat a bowl of cornflakes.
Do you feel that level of safety right now?
Absolutely not.
It is almost inevitable that there have been thousands of people that have had from a very mild to perhaps serious allergic reaction to Starlink, you know.
If it had not been for public interest organizations going in and testing that corn on our own, doing the government's job for it, this scandal would never have come out, and this potential health risk to humans never would have been discovered.
There are 3 government agencies which are responsible for the safety of GMOs. The Department of Agriculture is responsible for assessing the environmental impacts of GMO crops and regulates GMO field testing. But a study of over 8,000 GMO field test applications showed that the USDA did not require a single environmental assessment. The Environmental Protection Agency regulates insecticides. BT, a natural insecticide, is engineered into every cell of genetically engineered BT crops. The Food and Drug Administration is responsible for food safety. Any novel substance in food must be tested.
When the biotech companies went to get regulatory approval, they did so on the basis that what they were doing was substantially equivalent, was the term which was being used, substantially equivalent to classical breeding practices, and therefore it should not be regulated in any way. At the same time, however, companies have insisted on patenting their products, and in order to get a patent, it has to be different than anything else. So on the one hand, we're saying it's very different because we don't want to patent it. On the other hand, it's substantially equivalent, so don't bug us with regulation.
Substantial equivalency is obviously nonsense. These, at the cellular level, again, these foods have bacteria, viruses, new genetic constructs that no other foods ever had in history. They're clearly not equivalent.
Since GMOs were considered substantially equivalent to regular food, they fall into the GRAS, or Generally Recognized as Safe category, and the government does not require testing or labeling.
To me, one of the most incomprehensible things about U.S. policy is that we do not even require the labeling of genetically engineered foods.
Many of those GMOs are in the form of corn syrup and soy lecithin. In 2002, a concerned mother in Oregon put a couple $1,000s into an initiative to label GMOs.
How can we trust the same multinational corporations that told us that PCBs, DDT, and dioxin are safe? They don't even want us to know what it is that we're eating. The FDA ignored their own scientists' warnings about the dangers of genetically engineered foods. This is our children's future we're talking about. Let's join 25 other countries that require labeling. It doesn't cost their farmers or consumers anymore. Vote yes on 27. Let's label genetically engineered foods.
The measure was defeated by the $4.6 million industry campaign that features a farmer who resembles the mother.
The last thing we need is more government red tape, more bureaucracy, and higher costs. But that's exactly what Oregon farmers, consumers, and taxpayers would get if Measure 27 passes.
Poll after poll has revealed that 80 to 90% of Americans want GMO food labeled. But the Genetically Engineered Food Right to Know Act that Representative Kucinich, Senator Boxer, and others have introduced every year since 1999 is still waiting to be voted on by Congress.
The public in Europe has reacted with anger and concern at the idea that genetically engineered food products will be on their supermarket shelves. The latest polls showed at least 75% of the European public do not want genetically engineered food.
In response to demand from their citizens, all 15 countries of the European Union adopted rules requiring the labeling of genetically engineered food.
But I think there's a very good reason why the corporations have fought so hard against this labeling. It isn't just about consumer choice. Without labeling, there's no real traceability for the health effects of genetically engineered foods. If you're a mother and you're feeding your baby infant formula, and it's not labeled as genetically engineered with soy, for example, and your child has a toxic or allergic reaction, there's no way you're going to know that that was caused by genetic engineering because it's not on the label. If, however, it is on the label, then you can say, you know what, maybe that contributed to this response in my child. You go to your doctor records it, and there's traceability, and we can begin to get a database on the health effects. And of course, once that database is created, then we have liability to the corporations. So they're opposing labeling, not just because it creates choice and they're afraid that their products will not be bought, but also because labeling is the key way we can trace the health effects of genetically engineered foods and the key way to get the corporations liable for these health effects.
The Japanese people are deeply concerned about the effects of genetically modified food. A trade representative stated, "We will watch the children in the United States for the next 10 years." In addition to claiming these products were safe, the biotech industry claimed they would increase yield.
Advances in biotechnology can help us produce more food on land we already cultivate or on land that's currently unsuitable for farming.
Monsanto submitted a regulatory package to both the FDA and the EPA for Roundup Ready soybeans, the first really big commercial crop. It's really very curious, how shallow actually the science was. They didn't look at routine stresses, drought, plant pathogens, other things that, soybean plants deal with in the environment. In the year 2000, a team of scientists based at the University of Arkansas documented decreases in the size of the root system, and under droughty conditions, these reductions were 25%. Now, that 25% impairment is going to translate into several bushels of lost yield in any part of the world. It's a very big impact. The other gap in the regulatory reviews was that no one bothered to explore the impact of the spraying of Roundup over the top of soybean plants on the capacity of the soybean plant to affix nitrogen. And it's one of the most important environmental benefits of soybeans. It's a legume, like peas, so you don't have to put nitrogen fertilizer in your garden when you're growing peas or soybeans. And we're only now starting to study this because farmers have observed problems in some fields with Roundup Ready soybeans. I mean, they just did terrible and couldn't explain why.
One of the biggest threats to yield comes from superweeds, weeds that have become resistant to herbicides like Roundup. In 2003, mare's tail, a superweed, spread into 21 states. Now farmers have to use dangerous chemicals such as 2,4-D, which is similar to Agent Orange and has been proven to cause birth defects. Instead of spraying less, they are spraying more. But how did this controversial new technology get approved by the government in the first place?
At the end of the first Bush administration, George Bush's administration, Dan Quayle ran something called a Competitiveness Council.
We will ensure that biotech products will receive the same oversight as other products, instead of being hampered by unnecessary regulation.
What Quayle's council recommended is that there be no regulation at all for these foods. This outraged FDA scientists. There is voluminous documentation showing that FDA scientists said this food needs to be tested. This food can be toxic. This food can create new allergens. The genetic engineering process, the cell invasion technique that is genetic engineering, can lower nutrition. It can create immune problems in laboratory animals. All these things need to be tested, much less the environmental effects. But Dan Quayle and his council said, no way. We want to be the first in the world to market this food. FDA still said no. So what do? They brought in a deputy commissioner for food policy, a man named Michael Taylor. Michael Taylor used to work at King & Spalding as Monsanto's senior counsel there. He had written up the industry regulations, which were basically no regulations, and of course, he allowed this no regulation policy to become official U.S. policy in 1992.
Monsanto employees and government regulatory agency employees are the same people. And to give you one example, there's countless names on this list, but one that kind of stands out to me, the biggest, is Linda Fisher. Linda Fisher, for the past 7 years, has been an executive vice president for Monsanto Corporation. She is now the deputy minister for the EPA, also as a deputy minister under George Bush Sr.'s administration. Prior to that, she was with Monsanto. And prior to that, she was with the EPA. She's been back and forth 3 times. And the list goes on and on like that in Washington. I have written a letter to our Attorney General, John Ashcroft, and I begged him for help with this monumental crisis that farmers are facing and we're facing. His response was that it is not their policy to get involved in private litigation matters. I have since learned that Mr. John Ashcroft has submitted a brief to the U.S. Supreme Court regarding a similar patent infringement case to be heard in October. He preyed upon the Supreme Court to uphold these new plant patents to protect the corporations that own the patents. Upon learning this, I also learned that Mr. Ashcroft had received the largest campaign contribution that Monsanto gave any 2000 political candidate in his failed bid for Senate re-election.
Deregulate, which is basically telling from the executive branch everybody to look the other way.
Companies now do testing themselves and report their findings to the government. The process is voluntary.
If we started really asking the right questions, we would stop this technology for the next 50 or 100 years.
But just the opposite has happened. In the US alone, genetically modified canola, corn, cotton, and soybeans, which were non-existent in the 1980s, were grown on 3.7 million acres in 1996. That jumped to 100 million acres in 2003. In 1998, Mexico banned the planting of genetically engineered corn to protect their agricultural heritage.
In Mexico, there are literally hundreds of varieties of corn. Some of them are adapted to very wet climates, some to very dry climates. Some of them are resistant to certain specific pests. Some of them have different tastes. Some of them are good for doing popcorn that was invented by the Aztecs. Some varieties are good to make tortillas or to feed the cattle. There's a whole bunch of kinds of corn in Mexico.
Around 7,000 years ago, the people who lived in Mexico started domesticating maize, or corn, and an intimate relationship developed between humans and the plant. Corn is not only their food supply, it is also part of the culture.
In the mountains in Jalisco, the farmers plant on purpose their cornfields near areas where the wild corn grows, the teocintle. And the reason why they do that is because they know perfectly well that they get resistance to pests transferred from the wild strain into the cultivated strain.
We don't know which parts of that diversity are going to be useful, and we need to preserve them all. Now, most of the diversity for crops is contained within so-called land races. These are the plants that small farmers, generally in very diverse areas of the world, maintain in very small plots with selection for the very specific conditions of the plots, which might be certain altitude, frost, or drought, or very specific conditions. That is really the basis of diversity that we are continuously tapping from to maintain our commercial production of crops, to feed the world, basically.
The 1970 corn blight in the United States destroyed millions of acres of corn. The U.S. was lucky to find a strain of landrace corn originally from Mexico that could resist the blight. In the year 2000, Dr. Chapella discovered genetically modified corn growing in this remote area. The campesino farmers had bought kernels of unlabeled American GM corn from their local government store to eat. And as farmers have done for thousands of years, they ate some and planted some.
Farmers make no difference between seed and grain for the obvious reason that grains are seeds and are viable seeds. They have a little embryo. They have the little baby inside the seed, and if you put it in the ground, it will germinate.
The genetically modified seed crossed with the landrace corn, and contamination entered the gene line of this ancient grain.
Ese maíz se come, se está vendiendo a toda la población y en todo México, supongo.
Porque no saben en realidad qué consecuencias puede tener.
Es un maíz para consumo humano, entonces, ¿cómo va a ser malo, no?
It is cheaper for Mexicans to buy imported corn from the United States than it is to grow it themselves. This is because American corn is subsidized by the taxpayers, whereas Mexican corn is not subsidized. Nevertheless, many Mexicans prefer to grow their native corn varieties.
¿Por qué usted está tan necio de estar plantando la misma semilla todo el año? ¿Cuál no comprar?
Bueno, nosotros lo tomamos como un ahorro, porque también a veces, digamos, falta de económico, pues no tenemos que correr a la Conasur para comprarlo. Sin embargo, estamos comiendo, según nosotros estamos comiendo lo mejor, que es un maíz que
todo eso.
Sí.
Es que el trabajo que ustedes hacen aquí es un trabajo que reditúa, pero para el mundo.
Sí.
The farmers said,
if we do have transgenic elements in our corn, is it going to be like our colleague in Canada? Will the multinational companies come and demand payment for the presence of the gene?
In November 2001, Dr. Chapela published a peer-reviewed paper in the science journal Nature revealing the GMO contamination.
We took this very seriously from the beginning, and we have been doing studies and collecting samples and sending them around, trying first to duplicate Ignacio Chapela's results, which we did, and now going a step further and identify this problem.
This is an issue that is a bit contentious because we didn't want to in any way jeopardize our genetic heritage. The first thing is we didn't want that to happen. Whether that is going to have other consequences, well, that's a matter of debate. The fact is those sequences were not supposed to be in those corns, and they are now. And that's a big problem for us.
What happens when you introduce into these areas a single genotype, the one industrial crop, that preferentially passes its genes into the progeny? What happens is basically you crowd out that diversity. And this, in the long term, is a major threat to food security. Not only for those people who live there, but also for us, also for our industrial production of food. If we do not have access to those genetic resources, we're going to be facing challenges that we are not going to be able to solve.
It is not just genetically modified corn that has raised patenting issues in Mexico.
Current international system of patents does not protect in any way traditional knowledge, and we have had a number of problems in Mexico related to that. I think there are 3 or 4 applications for patents for tortillas. Like it was a new thing, like somebody had invented tortillas, which of course have existed for 3,000, 5,000 years, we don't know. First of all, some people will debate, and I think it is a worthwhile debate, if life should be patented at all. And that's a discussion that humanity as a species hasn't done properly. And it is a sort of pending homework, something we need to do.
By the year 2003, the U.S. had sold millions of pounds of GMO corn to Mexico for less than the cost of growing it. Around the world, resistance was mounting against the U.S. exported genetically modified crops. The loss of corn exports to Europe is worth around $300 million a year. This has only compounded the farm crisis in North America.
On the one side of the farmer, there's the oil and natural gas companies and fertilizer companies, seed and chemical and machinery companies and banks. And then the farmer is literally in the middle of an agri-food chain. Downstream, there's processors, railways, grain companies, restaurants, packers, etc. And what's happened in that chain is each link, with the exception of the farm link, is being dominated by fewer and fewer, larger and larger corporations. Those huge corporations that face little competition are able to extract extremely large revenues and profits out of that chain and leave very little for the family farmers. And what the family farmers do get is quickly snatched away by chemical and seed and fertilizer companies who themselves have tremendous market power.
Farmers are not the ones making the money. There's money being made on both sides of the farmers, but not the farmers.
When you put $1.50 on the counter for a loaf of bread, that money then moves through the hands of the retailer. And these are $10 billion corporations with only one or two competitors. And the miller that makes the flour can do the same thing. The grain company that sourced the grain. And by the time it gets back to the farm, there's only a nickel left. And of that nickel, you've got those powerful input suppliers on the other side who can take that nickel right out of the farmer's pocket.
I just did a study of the economic costs and benefits of BT corn. The official USDA statistics show that the cost of producing a bushel of corn is about $3.20 or $3.40, and the net return to the farmers maybe $2.20. So they're losing $1 on every bushel. And one might ask, well, how is a businessman, if you're losing $1 on every unit that you sell and you're growing 140 per acre, so you're losing like $140 an acre, how can you stay in business? And the answer is government subsidies.
Subsidies support the most widely grown crops: corn, wheat, cotton, and soybeans. These are the crops that the industry has targeted as the first GMO crops.
So if you're an agribusiness company producing inputs into a market, and especially inputs that are going to be more expensive, it must be reassuring to you to know that regardless of how big the gap is between what the farmers get from the market and what it cost them to produce, the government's going to be there to make up that difference.
In 2002, President Bush signed one of the largest subsidy bills yet.
Although it's certainly not labeled the GMO seed rebate, nonetheless, it's part of what's keeping farmers interested in these costly production systems.
This results in every American taxpayer paying a personal subsidy to the agricultural biotech industry. The United States subsidizes its crops. Europe subsidizes its farmers. And Canada and Mexico subsidize neither.
Farmers that are producing grain right now are quite clearly losing money on every bushel. The prices are below the cost of production. On a lot of farms, families deal with that by one or both spouses taking an off-farm job. And the irony is they bring that money back to the farm and use it to pay those input bills. So you literally have the case where small family farmers and their spouses are working off-farm and subsidizing Monsanto and chemical companies, fertilizer companies with that money.
If you talk to people in agricultural circles about, well, what's the important skill of farming? It's marketing. It's taking full advantage of the government programs. It's dealing well with your banker and all the people that you lease land from and managing equipment well. And, those are the skill sets. It's not their understanding of the biology of their soils or their production system or the traditional skills that one would think about. What it takes to be a farmer in America today has really changed, and the skill set of farmers has become divorced from the managing of this biological process, which we call food production. rural America, people value community and neighborliness and friendship. But as farms get bigger and more homogeneous and more of the control of the capital and the management decisions gets moved to St. Louis or Minneapolis or Kansas City, and you've really just got sort of hired hands out there on the farm, there's an erosion of the richness of the community that shares that space, and a lot of things get sort of lost as a result of that.
My family has been enduring a living hell since this began. I am sure this is what led to my father's recent heart attack. He has been physically and emotionally shattered since this began. It has been heart-wrenching to watch our reputations be destroyed in our own community over something we did not do. I believe that the patenting of crops that extend to the progeny, in other words, the seed that a crop produces, like soybeans here, which cannot be kept controlled or kept separated on our farms, is nothing short of insane.
A lot of people in the industry try and paint a picture that, listen, 60% of our food is processed food, has some genetic engineered, product in it, so forget it, it's over. Your resistance is useless. Well, this is nonsense. The vast majority of our foods, the wheat, the rice, our fruits, our vegetables, are not genetically engineered. The vast majority of the food we eat is not genetically engineered. But right now, probably the key issue is the current controversy over genetically engineered wheat.
Even some of the farmers that thought they might like genetically modified canola originally are saying no to genetically modified wheat. We had the Canadian Wheat Board sitting at the table with Greenpeace and the Canadian Health Coalition, the Council of Canadians, and a whole bunch of farm organizations. And they had a news conference to release a letter to the Prime Minister that said, we don't want GM wheat. And that letter was signed by an additional 200 organizations.
Genetically modified wheat is a very, very serious concern for us up in North Dakota, and we have 124 acres of GMO wheat planted in research plots throughout the state. We don't know where those research plots are, although that's proprietary information. So there's already the potential for contamination. If a custom combiner combines some GMO wheat and then goes to combining some non-GMO wheat, the contamination is going to occur. When it does, we'll lose our markets. It's that simple.
What Monsanto told our legislature here in North Dakota was that if they attempted to put a moratorium on the introduction of this wheat, that one, they would pull all of their research dollars out of our state and our universities, which I quite frankly was very happy to hear, and two, they would file a lawsuit against the state of North Dakota for anti-commerce. This was the way that they tried to sell us, the state, a new product.
In the past, there were public institutions that supplied the farmers objective analysis of new technologies.
Universities started playing an important role in asking questions about this back then in the 70s, but soon enough it was evident that we did not want to have universities asking questions. So there was a big influx of money from industry to support research at universities, and that led to research that was favorable to the development of the industry and publicity that was simply promotional of the technologies.
The reality is that in our land-grant university system, and certainly in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, there's a small tolerance for people doing research that directly challenges the conventional wisdom.
It's ridiculous. You know, the recent work that we've done on the movement of transgenes in corn in the Centers of Diversification was run on $2,000. Compare that to $25 million coming the other way in exactly my college. And that is the only piece of work that I know is actually happening.
The biotech industry aggressively attacked scientists whose research questioned the safety and impact of genetically modified crops. Renowned scientist Dr. Arpad Pushtai was suspended 2 days after discussing his research that raised questions about the depressed immune systems and growth of rats which had been fed genetically modified potatoes. Cornell University researcher John Losey found that when caterpillars of the monarch butterfly were fed Bt corn pollen in the lab, 40% of them died unexpectedly. His research was denigrated by the biotech industry. Nature magazine retracted Ignacio Chapella's paper after publishing his peer-reviewed work. Biotech enthusiasts challenged the interpretation of his findings.
Biology was a very diverse field of inquiry, but because of the advent of this technology, we are seeing a narrowing down and a trimming off of all those branches of biology just to the benefit of this one side. And I very much want to fight against that. Just as we are losing genetic diversity, we are losing intellectual diversity that we are going to find very, very needed in the future.
The conventional wisdom in the U.S. today is that ag biotechnology is progress. There's not a lot of encouragement for young scientists to carry out research that might raise questions about that basic judgment.
The corporate control of genetic research is not limited to the field of agriculture.
They allowed the patenting of one of the genes responsible for breast cancer. And many researchers who'd been working on a cure for breast cancer were no longer allowed to use that gene in their research because another company had patented it and charged them very, very high fees. Some of the major pharmaceutical companies have gone into university laboratories and sued those laboratories and sued researchers who are using the genes that they own. This is probably the largest private takings of what should be the commons that we all own in common that you could possibly imagine. And I think one of the most disturbing economic trends of our times.
While biotech companies take over on an intellectual level, and genetic engineering takes over on a cellular level, multinational corporations are taking over worldwide by consolidating our food supply.
The combination of Kraft and Nabisco creates a real global leader in the food industry. Scale is a real advantage in this industry. As Kraft has proven, it increases both efficiency and effectiveness.
The average citizen doesn't really understand both the momentum and the extent to which consolidation is taking place in our whole food and agriculture system. Just to give you a couple of examples, 80% of our beef products now are being processed by just 4 companies. In seed companies, the vast majority of the seed that farmers plant now comes from just 4 clusters of companies. And what's even more worrisome now is in the last decade, that same kind of concentration has been taking place in the retail sector. And Heffernan now projects that in the next 10 years, all of the food in the retail level in the world will be controlled by 6 retail firms, only one of which will be American, and that's Walmart. Now, that means that increasingly, we're not going to have any choice about what's on the shelves in our supermarkets. What's going to be there is what some broker in a consolidated firm decides is going to return the largest profit.
One of the problems that the biotechnology industry has is that it's done nothing for the American consumer. There's nothing there. There's no genetically engineered food that does anything, no more nutrition, nothing for us. So how are they going to sell this technology to the American people? Well, they've come up with this idea that maybe biotechnology should be sold as the way to feed a starving world.
With world population expected to increase by 2 billion people in the next 30 years, biotechnology could provide an important way to produce enough food.
One major problem with that, the reason why about 800 million people starve every day, and that is a tragic fact, has nothing to do with the amount of food available. Most of these people around the world who were starving used to be farmers. But because of the World Bank and the National Monetary Fund giving huge loans to these countries could no longer allow for subsistence farming. They had to grow expensive export crops back to the First World to pay back those loans. So they kicked all these hundreds of millions of farmers off their farms. They end up in the Bhopals and the Mexico cities and the Brasilias of the world without money. They no longer are growing their own food, and they're competing for the scarce jobs available in the new industrialization of these countries. They are no longer food independent. They're food dependent.
Amartya Sen, a Pulitzer Prize-winning economist, after a decade of work, pointed out again and again that the problem of hunger is not a production problem, it's an access problem. It's getting entitlement to food, not producing food, that's the problem. We're, in fact, overproducing the major commodities to the extent where farmers can't recover their production costs. And so we have huge subsidies. You know, we have 800 million people on this planet right now who are malnourished in an era of overproduction where farmers can't recover their production costs.
When wealthy countries subsidize their crops, they undercut the markets of developing countries.
In 1994, on Christmas Eve, by the way, for the first time we said, you know what, we're going to try and have international rules on patenting. This was driven, of course, by the United States. And here's what's behind it. If you have gone into a third world country and you've patented a plant or a tree, the United States wants to be able to go back to that country and say, no one in this country, even though this plant originated here, can use it without paying us the patent fee. To do that, they've got to harmonize patent laws around the world. That's really the big prize for the corporations. It's one thing to make sure we're controlling the U.S. market, but if we can take these plants that we've gotten from the third world and make sure that no one in the third world can use them without paying the companies that patent fee, that's the big bonanza for the corporations.
The generalized perception in Latin America, I also think in Mexico, and many other parts of the world also, the new unipolar system has benefited the United States more than it has benefited the minorities of impoverished countries of the world. This is an issue of big concern because there are not so many political alternatives around. We may eventually go back to despotic types of rule that I don't think will have in any way to make countries like Latin America or Africa or Asia progress. We really need compassion for the people in the world that have less.
The resistance to globalization is that it stems from the insights of some people that, you know, the corporations, they want to be able to go in and make the money, but they don't want responsibility when things don't work out.
One of the most ironic parts of the fact that the biotechnology industry is saying that it's going to feed the world is that it has created a new technology called Terminator technology. And this technology is basically a suicide gene that's put into crops, so after one planting, they commit suicide. You cannot save the seed because the seed then is sterile. It will lead to no crops in the next season. There's 15 patents by first world companies on this suicide technology. Can you imagine what is going to happen if that suicide gene pollutes crops around the world?
A few years earlier, a lot of people were saying, well, won't these technologies outcross into wild species? And the promoters said, no, there will be no outcrossing. And then just in a few short years, they were back saying, well, okay, there is outcrossing, but now we have a new technology that'll help deal with that. And this, of course, raises the question, well, what about outcrossing of the Terminator gene?
They are also developing trader technology so that a farmer has to spray his field with proprietary chemical in order for seeds to germinate and grow.
We have the potential of ending up with green deserts. where you don't see the difference. You know, the environment will continue to be green, but it is being transformed from inside. And when that cracks, when that monoculture breaks down, it's going to be very massive.
As we move into the future, what could we find on our supermarket shelves? There are thousands of test sites for new GMOs in the United States. In 2002, the USDA condemned 50 million pounds of soybeans contaminated with GMO corn engineered to manufacture a pig vaccine.
My biggest concern is that we're merely going to go into the future believing that, somehow the technologists are going to solve the food problem, then we're all going to be okay. And, we're going to have a very, very rude shock.
The biotechnology industry, of course, is not simply interested in genetically engineered crops. We are seeing them trying to extend their reach throughout the rest of the living community. Right now, our government is looking at approving genetically engineered fish, 15 different kinds of fish, as well as crustaceans and just about anything else that we eat out of the ocean.
It is estimated that if just 60 genetically engineered salmon were released, the wild population of salmon could be extinct in 40 generations.
Genetically engineered livestock and poultry, and also genetically engineered insects and trees. It is the industrial mindset now made the biology of our food. But something happened on the way to their future. People began to think about the consequences of our food system. And they said, you know what, we want a different food future. We want a different relationship to food, to the environment, to the farmer, to the worker, to our own bodies.
What would it take to change the American food system to make farming sustainable and improve public health and environmental quality?
What we're trying to do in sustainable agriculture is to use resources that are in the local ecology and recycle those resources within the system rather than taking resources from another system or another ecology and bring them in. And we should be using solar energy to fuel our systems as nature does rather than relying on imported petroleum or other resources.
A century ago, people bought locally produced food. Today, food in a supermarket has traveled an average of 1,500 miles. Apples were grown all over America. Now they are shipped from China. This uses more imported oil and increases our dependency on other countries for food. The food from this farm travels an average of 50 miles.
About 10 years ago, we started a program for Bay Area families where they can get a basket of our produce once a week. It's called community-supported agriculture. And our relationship with those families encouraged us to really diversify. And as a result, as you walk around this farm, you'll see that each field has many different things growing. There's fruits, nuts, citrus, there's grapes, as well as row crops like tomatoes and eggplant and corn.
We've been farming organically for about 25 years because it is a system of farming where you are thinking about the human relationship to agriculture. You're thinking about primarily producing good food that you have no doubt about what character and quality it has, food that's healthy, that you have no doubt that my kids can eat, And so we've looked to evolve ourselves in a system that is diverse and healthy and sustainable. We have to respect nature's logic in all of this. We have to respect the millenniums of history that have gone into breeding. This is the work of thousands of generations of people who have plucked the wild onion, developed a little bigger one, chosen that over time. And it's not something anyone can say they own.
In 1990, the U.S. government attempted to describe organic standards. After years of formulating the regulation, in 1997, it was revealed that the standards would allow irradiation, sewage sludge, and genetically modified organisms. The government received one of the largest consumer protests in history. 275,000 citizens wrote to the USDA, outraged by this, and demanded that organic standards be kept pure. The consumers prevailed.
The underpinnings of my conversion to organics are not so much the economic point, it's the health point. To protect my health, protect my family's health, and my neighbors. Because if I'm the steward of my own land, that also means I'm responsible for what's happening outside of my little parameters, my fence line. Our Saskatchewan Organic Directorate has taken this position that organic farming is a real alternative to the farm crisis.
There has been a revolution in genetic engineering, but there has also been a counter-revolution. People are returning to buying fresh produce grown by local farmers. Organic farming, farmers markets, and community-supported agriculture are only 3 of the many alternatives to the industrialized food model. South Dakota and Nebraska, along with 8 other states, have passed constitutional amendments or state legislation that ban non-family-owned farming.
When the corporation said Nebraskans don't have the authority to ban we corporate persons from owning farmland, the Nebraska Supreme Court said the Nebraskans can put whatever they want in their constitution. This is their fundamental right. It's the essence of the American democratic system.
The consumer is still king. And the problem is that consumers can't act unless they have adequate information. So one of the things that we can all do is to get as much information as we can, to get that information into the hands of the public, into the hands of consumers, so that consumers can continue to exercise their choice.
Because the food system is fluid, it can change quickly based on the opinions of the public. But if genetically modified food is not labeled, how are consumers able to exercise their rights? The choices we make at the supermarket determine the future of food.
Food is one of the most intimate things we do. And if we don't have any choices about that, I think that's a very troubling scenario.
There are large groups of people in other countries that have never bought into the American model of chemical-intensive large-scale agriculture, and they certainly have not bought into the notion that the efficiencies that one gains by having 2 airline manufacturers in the world, or 4 automakers, or 2 makers of software, they believe that whatever gains you might make in efficiency are lost because you lose diversity. Whether there's going to be any serious change or challenge to the bulk of the way that agricultural land gets managed and farm businesses are organized, I think that's an open question, and frankly, I don't think it will happen unless the American public and farmers themselves sort of stand up and say, wait a minute, we just don't want to go any further down this road. And, we are a government of the people, for the people, and by the people, and hey, we're the people. We don't want to go there.
It's up to you.